Well, good evening, everyone. We're ahead of schedule here. Go figure. Bodes well for what comes next. And good to see you here. Hey, Tom. Welcome. People were here 15 minutes early, so this is, again, a good sign. Everyone's chatting, and we're looking forward to a great 3 days together as community. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 13th Triennial Conference on the History of Women Religious Lives and Archives. My name is Darren Dochuk. I'm the co-director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, also a professor in the Department of History, and my partner at Cushwa is David Lantigua, who unfortunately can't be with us today as he is participating in a conference abroad. There are many people I'm going to start off to thank, that we need to thank for helping us to arrive at the start of this exciting conference. Special thank you goes to the Morris Inn catering team and to the Notre Dame Conference Center team, especially Lisa Vervinkt, Paula Frederick, and Anthony Roberts. And as you see, each or all of them and other McKenna Hall and Morris Inn staff this week, please say thanks and join all of us really in extending words of gratitude to them. This is a major undertaking, as you can imagine. Their work is greatly appreciated. Thanks to the conference's co-sponsor, the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College. And of course, we owe an immense thanks to Shane Ulbrich and Madonna Noak at the Cushwa Center for taking on so much for such a large and complicated conference. This right after we hosted one of another conference of a similar size just in April to celebrate the Cushwa Center's 50th anniversary. So they have done double duty here in the span of a few months. Let's thank them with an applause. There's been much to celebrate during this 50th anniversary year. The coincidence of that milestone and this triennial conference have made it an especially busy time at the center, but the overlap couldn't be more fitting. The Conference on the History of Women Religious had its beginnings 38 years ago in October 1987, when the Cushwa Center hosted a colloquium at Notre Dame on the history of women religious in the United States. An initial cohort from that meeting were inspired to build a network that would foster research and publication for years to come. From the time it published the first issue of its newsletter in 1988 and hosted its first conference in 1989, the History of Women Religious Network drew together a community of researchers and archivists dedicated to preserving the historical record of vowed women and integrating their stories into the larger narratives of their times and places. As many of you know, a steady, indispensable presence for the effort was its longtime coordinator, Sister Karen Kennelly, whose passing at age 90 we mourned in late 2023. Sister Karen had fully retired from her CHWR duties 10 years earlier in 2013, placing the conference in the hands of my predecessor as Cushwa Center Director, Kathleen Sprouse Cummings. Kathy, where are you? I saw you. Kathleen, along with a number of collaborators, including several present this week, Carol Colburn, Margaret McGinnis, Tom Zheznik, and Judith Sutera, carried the conference forward. And we'll have more to say about that recent history and about the future of the CHWR during our Tuesday evening banquet. For now, I want to briefly share a few more acknowledgements. We want to thank you all for being here for what promises to be an exciting and energizing few days. Between plenaries and panel sessions, we have more than 100 speakers on the schedule, representing 14 countries on 5 continents. Thank you for making that travel to Notre Dame and we hope you enjoy our typical late spring days here in South Bend. I'll just note, to give you some context, so the 50th anniversary conference that we just hosted had scholars representing 10 countries, 3 continents, and 70 different presenters total. So Madonna and Shane have taken it up a notch, which is typical of the work they do at Cushwa. It also deserves special mention just how many archivists have become committed regulars of this conference, both as presenters and attendees. And I'd like to ask right now, how many of you in the audience here are archivists? If you could just raise your hand. Thank you so much, and welcome. This is obviously the focus of this conference, but it has long been an important aspect of this conference and the theme, again, for this year in particularly. Hopefully, and no doubt, fostering conversation between researchers and archivists, and again, we look forward to the conversations ahead. We want to acknowledge the Cushwa Center's postdoctoral research associates, Melissa Coles and Angela Gia, over there, all right? They're not only presenting papers and chairing sessions during the conference, but they've also been a tremendous help over the past week, month, year, with so many details that go into this sort of event, especially the very complicated work of piecing together panel groups. So thank you. A few key collaborators behind this conference were pulled away from attending either because of other plans long in the making or sudden demands back at their home institutions. First, and as I mentioned earlier, is my co-director at the Cushwa Center, David Lantigua, who is in Spain for another conference and will also be in Rome in the coming days to deliver a talk. Another is Jacqueline Willie Romero, a past Cushwa postdoc and one of the members of this year's CHWR conference committee. Jacqueline, like each of the other committee members, has been excellent to work with at every phase of the process. And we were sorry to learn 2 weeks ago that she would need to stay home this week to attend to departmental matters that arose unexpectedly. We want to thank her and also introduce and thank the other members of the conference committee. Christopher Allison, who is director of the McGreal Center for Dominican Historical Studies at Dominican University. Molly Gower on the faculty in Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College, where she was just named Vice President for Mission last month. Congratulations, Molly. And Killian, who is coming from Ohio Dominican University and will join us here at the University of Notre Dame officially next month as a faculty member in the English department. And Deirdre Raftery, professor of the History of Education at University College Dublin School of Education, who we'll hear from in just a minute. So let's thank our committee as well. And finally, just a bit of housekeeping. After tonight's lecture, we'll reconvene in the morning here on the second floor of McKenna Hall. Some light breakfast will be available just outside this room starting at 8 a.m. Feel free to get up real early and take a walk around the lakes before it gets hot. We will, whatever the case, start panels at 9 a.m. here on the second floor of McKenna. Tomorrow evening, right around this time, directly outside this room, there will be an opportunity for a whole conference group photo at 7 p.m. for whoever wants to join us, and in that case, make sure you don't walk around the lakes beforehand. And again, that will just be right before our plenary. Later, is it 7:15, 7:30 is the plenary? Finally, a couple notes. A note for anyone staying at the Morris Inn or joining us for meals in the Morris Inn Ballroom. Feel free to do so, to join us for those meals throughout the next few days. I also just want to alert you, you all have your folders. There is the Corita Kent temporary display here at the Racklin Murphy Museum of Art. There should be enough time in between panels, perhaps over lunch hour, for you to make your way there. There's a map on the back, an amazing new addition, or a recent addition to Notre Dame, and we would certainly encourage you to make a visit if at all possible. And again, referencing the heat here, which, despite what I said earlier, is of course very atypical, at least at this time of year here in South Bend. If you want to avoid the heat in any other weather, there is a tunnel of sorts that goes from here to the Morris Inn. Just take the elevator or stairs down to the bottom level, and it's very nice, cool, has a bit of a breeze, as I just found out. It's a little, again, a little less direct. If you want to weather the weather, feel free to cross the street outside, but if you want, do make use of that. All right, enough of the housekeeping. I'm now very pleased to welcome Deidre Raftery to the podium to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Thank you, Deidre.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker this evening, Professor Katharine Massam from the University of Divinity in Melbourne. She's come quite a distance to be with us, and we really look forward to her paper, which is called Rewilding Authority, Catholic Women Religious in Synodal Times. Katharine is a historian of religion, with a particular interest in the intersection between Christian tradition and wider culture in post-colonial settler societies. She has a long-standing interest in the cultural history of Christian spirituality, and she's published 4 books and many scholarly articles and book chapters. Some of you will know her 2020 book entitled A Bridge Between Spanish Benedictine Missionary Women in Australia, which was shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Award in Australian History in 2021. Katharine has a new book which is in press as we speak, and I've had the privilege of seeing the proofs of it, and it's a wonderful study which I think we can all look forward to. The Promise of the Blessing, Presentation Sisters in Victoria since Vatican II. And her other very recent piece of work is a radio interview which you can download, and I think you'll be interested in that. Nuns Now, the Present and Future of Vowed Religious. Katharine was elected to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in 2017, and she is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, UK. Her many other tributes and her wonderful work, I think you'll become familiar with across the conference as she talks to us and shares her research with us. But what we can look forward to now is Rewilding Authority, Catholic Women Religious in Synodal Times. Please join me in welcoming Professor Katharine Massam.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you, Shane and Madonna and the team at the Cushwa Centre. It's a pleasure to be here. I was reflecting that I was first at Notre Dame in November 1990 for a conference run by the Cushwa Centre, which was pivotal in my doctoral preparation. And I've been a couple of times to this gathering, always found a vibrant and helpful and generous community. So it's lovely to be back with you. And thank you for the invitation. As I've said, I'm grateful to the conference. I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I write and pay respect to them, their elders, and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. At a workshop in 2006 on the reconfiguration of religious communities in the new millennium, the Australian theologian and Sister of Mercy Patricia Fox named the distinctive lifestyle of contemporary apostolic congregations as an art of theological reflection that involves dialogue with both the signs of the times and with our faith tradition. Navigating change in the decades since the Second Vatican Council had, she argued, honed the capacity of religious communities around the globe for theological reflection and deepened the appreciation of both community life and shared decision-making as commitments that shape a culture and also shape the people who live within that culture. Patricia Fox saw this capacity, this work, flowing from a long apprenticeship in a way of life that was marked by the skills of dialogue, social analysis, and reading the signs of the times. It was built on privileged access to the sacred sciences of theology and biblical studies, and it was a kind of theological reflection as a shared commitment so as to be able to welcome difference among themselves and beyond themselves, and therefore to practice in turn a second art that flows from the first, the art of living communion. The core principle that Patricia urged contemporary religious congregations to grasp was that our mission is to be communion as God is communion. It's communion, she argued, that transforms and restores human beings into the image of God and calls human beings into accepting the gift, the freedom to love as God loves. This is a high and also simple calling. It stretches back to the beginning of Cenobitic life, as scholars of the rule of St Benedict in the 6th century know well, and it's echoed profoundly in the contemporary emphasis on synodality. As the final report of the Synod put it last year, the practice of synodality calls the Church to mutual care, interdependence, and co-responsibility for the common good. It challenges both cultural individualism as well as what it called suffocating social communitarianism in order to respond with creativity and courage to the needs of mission, God's mission. These two arts at the core of religious life, the art of theological reflection to support the art of communion, offer rich resources for enabling the mutual care and co-responsibility for the common good that the Synod wants for the Church, and that in turn are surely urgent for the future of the planet. So tonight I want to invite you to think with me about where this art of communion has come from and how it might lean in to new possibilities. The paper has 3 parts. First, I want to sketch out some of the ancient understanding of authority and community, authority for communion, as we find it in the Rule of Benedict, that 6th century document that's been foundational for so much of religious life in the West. Then, drawing on the experience of just one apostolic congregation, the Presentation Sisters in Victoria in southeast Australia, whose records I know well, I'll argue that the shift in emphasis at the Second Vatican Council to engage the joys and hopes, fears and anxieties of the whole people of God has been decisive in a rewilding of authority. I'll step through the place of a particular method of theological reflection in that move for the Presentation Sisters, and then offer 2 brief examples of authority moving towards communion from that community's history. And then, bearing in mind Patricia Fox's insight into how the living of religious life forms and shapes people, how it shapes people well for communion with the other, I'll not so much conclude as invite consideration of the ways in which that rewilded relational authority holds a memory of the future, a hope for communities of faith, certainly, and also possibilities for increasing mutuality and directing attention to the signs of the times in politics and as a project of economic justice, a movement towards maybe economic democracy. I could have had that schema up as I was explaining it. I beg your pardon. There we go. So that's what I'm hoping to do, those 3 things. At the outset, though, let's define some terms. Rewilding is a concept that comes from ecology, a word about relationship and interconnection. Rewilding involves the restoration of ecosystems to the point where natural processes are re-established. The approach goes beyond conservation efforts for single species or patches of habitat. In a big picture, holistic approach, it's a philosophy that intervenes to set up the conditions where the ebb and flow of elements in the environment is healthy and self-sustaining. Because it aims to go back, to find a state of balance in order to then go forward, rewilding has a lot to offer in relation to thinking about traditions and histories of religious life, it seems to me. Globally, there are thousands of women religious who are clear that rewilding in its ecological sense is part of their care for the earth. It's well over 15 years since Sarah McFarlane-Taylor's work on Green Sisters showed us clearly the commitment of groups of American women religious to ecological justice as part of their faith. That organic work, galvanised all the more by Laudato Si, it's connected to the rewilding I'm thinking about. But my focus tonight is not the network of action for a light footfall on the planet, not as such. Instead, I'm using the rewilding impulse as a metaphor for the movements in authority in communities through the 20th century, and especially since the Vatican Council. So, metaphorically, and in keeping with the council that was famously about opening windows to let fresh breezes blow, Charles Bingham, the Canadian philosopher of education, urges us to notice that authority is like the wind. Influenced by Michel Foucault's work on power and interested above all in educational empowerment, Bingham is making the point that authority, like the wind, is a movement, is a relationship. It exists because of differences, different temperatures, different atmospheric pressures. It's part of the functioning of the air that we breathe. In the same way, authority flows from difference and it is pervasive. It's enacted in circuits. We see the network it activates, the effect on individuals and communities. Foucault has shown us that while power can curtail, constrain, direct and prevent, it can also actively produce and enable change. So with authority, in a dialogical and multidirectional system of navigation about responsibility, influence, respect and decision-making power, some interactions diminish freedom with domination and submission, and some enhance capacity and agency with reciprocity and dialogue to enable the health of the community. Authority is relational. It has a social character. In relation to the life and work of women religious, I'm interested in how the rewilding of authority has been embedded over time in a conversation that's bound up relationally with love. Love of God, love of neighbour, and also bound up with love with a capital L, with love as a theological conviction of who God is, and with God who is with us. Authority in this context is a pivot point, a valve, if you like, between power and love. Within Christian tradition, one of the most important resources for thinking about the social character of authority and love is the rule of Benedict. Framed in turbulent times after the fall of Rome, Benedict weaves together earlier teaching from the desert and from the East to provide a little rule for beginners who are seeking God in community under the authority of a leader, an abbot or an abbess. To set out some broad contours of the specialised and vast scholarly conversation about authority in the rule, I'm following tonight two Australian Benedictine scholars, Kim Harris and Margaret Malone especially. In a metaphor that certainly did not occur to Benedict, Kim Harris sums up monastic authority as midwifery. Like a midwife, Benedict's leaders are wise, sensitive, skilled, and adaptable. They understand that each life in their care is unique. To play their role well, they are emotionally engaged and disciplined, deeply aware that they are doing work that is not their own, but enabling, advising, encouraging someone else's labour. They are tuned into a power that is not their own, but is beyond them. The first line of the rule, listen, linked in the Latin to obey, applies to the abbot as well as to everyone else. It's a command to direct the heart towards authoritative teaching. The superior stands in the place of Christ and is called to represent Christ's love and service, to school the community on the path to God, loving all equally, striving themselves to be loved rather than feared. They need to pay attention to the particular people and circumstances around them. They need an empathetic imagination, effectively, to see others clearly and to adapt so that, in the famous phrase, the strong have something to strive for and the weak have nothing to fear. Authority is sensitive, engaged. Everyone in the community is called to listen, and the superior has a particular responsibility to listen to all the needs and all the realities. Margaret Malone talks about the particular call of the abbot in the Latin is to wage care and love, gerere cura. So to wage care in the same energetic sense as war might be waged, deploying all resources. To do this, the superior themselves needs particular emotional and spiritual maturity. Chapter 64 of the rule calls attention to the qualities that the community doesn't want in its leader. And Kim Harris helpfully flips those to the positive attributes that you might hope for: to be calm, confident, balanced, flexible, generous, and trusting. Under the judgment of God themselves, good superiors are aware of their own limits and frailty. They operate out of a sense of service and solemn responsibility. They take counsel, and above all, they pray. They are going to be held accountable for the flourishing of everyone. There's an intriguing allusion in Benedict's description of the abbot as a teacher too in this section. The superior should teach only what is of God and should do that so that the leaven of divine justice should be kneaded into the minds of her disciples. You'll recognise the yeast metaphor from the New Testament parables. The reign of God is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. The idea of leavening in Benedict is about leavening the minds of the community, transforming them to the mind of God. As we'll see in a minute, leavening is also a favourite metaphor of the theologians who were forerunners of the Second Vatican Council and to the vision of the Council documents, and to apostolic communities like the Australian Presentation Sisters who caught that vision. Yeast is not static. Yeast changes things, and working for communion entails change. This image of Presentation Sister Anne Halpin making bread at a family outreach program in the 1990s has a long metaphorical history. And I want now to introduce her community, the Presentation Sisters of Victoria. In what comes next, I'm thinking especially about yeast and where it is activated. I hope to show that before and after the renewal of the Council captured imaginations, the dynamic of relational authority, which we might also call love, was not internal to the community or directed towards God alone. In a decisive shift of emphasis at the Council, like the leaven in the dough, the dynamic of leavening was meant to bring the good news into transformational contact with the surrounding context. So that's where we're going in this bit. This image shows the Presentation Sisters at the Palm Sunday Peace Rally in the capital city of Melbourne in 1983. Some here might recognise Raphael Considine, poet and interpreter of their foundress Nano Nagel, on the right-hand edge, looking left. They were in the streets to support nuclear disarmament as committed supporters of Catholics for Peace, an organisation that had been co-convened for some years by Presentation Sister Shirley MacDonald, and Shirley MacDonald had been the preacher at the ecumenical service in the Anglican Cathedral just before this march. This group has a typical Australian foundation story of communities in Ireland responding in the spirit of the foundress to go where they were needed. In the 1870s, as Catholic schools lost government funding, the plea for teachers to save the church from sectarian hegemony was urgent, and Melbourne welcomed 2 presentation foundations. In 1996, they had been merged for maybe 40 years, and they elected the first Australian-born Mother General, Sebastian Lardy, in the middle of this photo. They had by that time a reputation as excellent teachers and educational innovators in diocesan roles. They had supple, outward-looking leadership that made them, according to one priest co-worker, tough, realistic, and unafraid women. They picture themselves as practical and down to earth. Another of their poets puts it in this way: imagine a woman's figure, kneeling, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, hands on the earth, and she and the earth are singing. So it's a vision of being connected and in communion. Also in the 1940s, the Presentation Sisters promoted the young Christian students movement in their schools, perhaps especially at Star of the Sea College, where Ahmed Tembi, on the left of the 1980s photo, had been appointed as the innovative principal in 1941, aged then 28. The YCS, along with the YCW, or Young Christian Workers, is significant for its impact on the life of the presentation community, especially for the rewilding of authority that goes with the understanding of leadership as leaven. The Leaven in the Dough was the title of a popular book by the French priest and YCW chaplain Henri Gaudin, published in 1943, full of stories and reflections and stylish illustrations drawn from daily life to make it, as the subtitle suggested, a manual for Christian life of our time. It was also a favourite metaphor for Joseph Cardine, the Belgian priest and the founder of the YCW, or in French, the Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, JOC, to give the shorthand adjective Josist. For Joseph Cardine and the young workers, the Josists, who caught his vision in the early decades of the 20th century, faith lived apart from the world was no faith at all. To them, the lay apostolate was an extension of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. It would form disciples in and through their own everyday context and form them for that context. You can see Cardine's quote on the screen. The only definition of a leader is as the leaven in the dough. Cardine told members this in one of his most quoted annual lectures. In the dough. Not alongside it, not even a millimetre away, but inside it. Leaders, you are the leaven in the dough. And as the American theologian Mary Kate Holman has shown, this image was also a touchstone for the French Dominican Marie-Dominique Chenu, forerunner of the Council, as he argued as early as 1937 against the detached power and purity of Christendom. It was a disincarnated ecclesiology, he said, when we hesitate to toss the yeast fully into the dough, fearing that if we did, we wouldn't be able to conserve religious purity. Rather, he said, the Christian call was to be the yeast thrown anew fully into the dough, the divine life assuming without anything left out all of human life, continuous incarnation in the mystical body of Christ. So incarnation means that the leavening of the disciples is for the world. The Josist movements committed to this leavening arrived in Melbourne officially in 1943, promoted by the diocese especially for their understanding of how ordinary believers should be oriented to the world to transform it. The YCW method of formation was a 3-step review of life or inquiry. In this process of see, judge, act, they would stand in the place of Christ and act for Christ in their context. Supported with study guides and by well-trained chaplains, they would see their situation with eyes informed by Scripture, especially the figure of Jesus. They would assess or judge how their reality fell short, and they would act to move the dial towards compassion, justice, freedom, dignity of the reign of God. Empowered by the 3-step see, judge, act, they would be the leaven. Why, you might be asking, is this movement important for the history of women religious? The short answer is because vocations to religious life and priesthood flourished in these groups. Certainly in the case of the Presentation Sisters, and anecdotally around the world, idealistic young women formed in this method of theological reflection after the Second World War were an important cohort of new recruits to religious communities. And then in the schools, switched on young teachers and those who'd heard about this method promoted the YCS. For example, in 1955, Ahmad Tembi and another sister, Edwardine Watson, spoke at the first Australian Liturgical Week, presenting a paper on religious education with Joseph's themes to support a deeper understanding of living the gospel in the world. In 1962, Star of the Sea hosted the first national gathering of YCS leaders and chaplains. As the Second Vatican Council rolled out, Ahmad was still principal and also superior of the community at Star, and lobbied by younger members of the community who'd been involved in the YCS, worked for the adult version, the National Catholic Girls Movement, Review of Life groups became part of the Presentation community itself. Everyone from former Mother General Sebastian to the newly professed met in small groups in the common room on Sunday afternoons to reflect and share perspectives and then offer feedback to the whole community. They were resourced by a talented local curate who said he was terrified. He was especially awed about Ahmad, but he was well grounded in the council documents. In the next decade, teams of sisters worked in curriculum design at the Catholic Education Office, and they formed review groups across congregations and fed the method into resources for classrooms, following a lesson plan mantra of experience shared, reflection deepened, faith expressed, and insights reinforced. So my point here is that structured theological reflection on experience was part of the culture, and it would become the hallmark of a wilder, more incarnational understanding of their call and their shared authority. How did that play out? So 2 quick examples. One, an individual one, focused on Ahmad Tembi, and one more corporate, focused on a parish ministry. First, Ahmad. Ahmad had been recognised as a leader in education and her community for more than 2 decades when she was appointed to lead a new diocesan teachers' college in 1966. Her role as foundation principal of what would become the Australian Catholic University put the Presentation ethos at the heart of the diocese, addressing the shortage of teachers for Catholic schools, addressing a felt and present need. When Mother Vincent Harold died suddenly the following year, and Ahmad was elected decisively as Mother General, her influence in setting the tone for other congregations and for the diocese did not diminish. There's a story that a visiting bishop asked Melbourne's Archbishop James Knox who were the 3 key men in the diocese, and Knox replied, perhaps putting the prelate in his place, myself, the Vicar General, and Ahmad Tembi. For Ahmad herself, although daunted by the election, She knew that there was a logic about her new role. Her opening address at the special chapter of renewal, which, as you'll know, was required of all congregations after the council, shows her attention to core issues, key words that come up: Christianity, sisters, Christ, chapter, congregation. In terms of Benedictine attentiveness, emotional maturity, and openness to judgment, these qualities are mirrored in the program of studies she had designed for trainee teachers at Christ College, the new diocesan centre. Her own capacity as a brilliant teacher depended on being able to read other people, being sensitive, calm, and accountable. She was, however, used to being in charge, and she could be something of a dictator when people did not see their capacities her own way. It was also a time of ferment. So as soon as it was practical, she set out to connect with wider currents of change and renewal in what was essentially a C section of a Josephist inquiry into governance and ministry in religious life. In 1971, with Sister Mary Kavanagh, another leading presentation educator, Ahmad completed a 6-month journey through Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Britain, and the United States on a fact-finding mission, seeing for herself, meeting people in person in order to resource her reflection and guide action. It's a very rich story, that tour. One example from her correspondence, sent right at the end of her trip, suggests something of her style: a rewilding of authority and her concern for communion. From a presentation convent in San Francisco in a sweltering August, Ahmad sent a card to dear friends from the Juniate, Fabian and Mary Magdalene. Fabian was on the council, Mary Magdalene was a music teacher. The friendship was deep and strong and kind of unlikely. It's a warm, honest, tired and loving greeting. Overall, the veteran of decades at the forefront of enterprises sums up: I still feel scared, of course, of leadership, but I think I am less in a panic after this trip than before, which is a blessing. She had taken every opportunity to learn and engage, and seeing the worst, she has an equanimity that core values will prevail. She remarks that the real thrust toward prayer here and across the country makes me feel that religious life here, with all its turmoil, will come through very well. She had a lot to integrate after the 6 months away, and she's writing to her friends asking for a chance to talk to a few trusted folk about how to report back to the wider group. She has a few ideas. Could they think through this together? What would work? Can they go away? Can they plan some short seminars before a big one? It's a highly intelligent, simple letter with an overarching concern for connection. She sends various greetings, and in conclusion, we get a sense of the freedom and commitment that marked Ahmad's life as well as her leadership. She says, "Often I thank God for the extraordinary friends he gave me. Aren't we lucky? I love you both more than I can say. God help us to be good. Your loving Ahmad." Her ready expression of love, as well as her confidence that what she doesn't like doesn't matter, that equanimity that she's found, her confidence that that doesn't matter because the life of prayer is flourishing, both of those things, the ready expression of love, the confidence that everything will work out through prayer, that's a stance that Benedict would affirm. Now I want to move to the institution that Ahmad was administering. When she returned home, there were letters of request to her for presentation sisters to join new diocesan task forces in various new parishes. The parish of the Resurrection in outer suburban Keysborough was one of these. And I want to highlight just one aspect of the ministry there, an initiative called the Freedom Club, spearheaded by Sister Nance Morgan. 3 presentation sisters came to the Keysborough Task Force in 1974, and you can see them here at the parish fete. Nance Morgan is on the right, chatting to a parishioner. Nance was a former full-time worker for the National Catholic Girls Movement. She was in her mid-40s and she was 20 years a sister. Her role was pastoral care of young families. A good listener, imbued with the cardine practice of see, judge, act through the NCGM, her ministry emerged out of the lives of the people. A lot of her time was spent chatting at the local shopping centre. Over cups of coffee, discussion began about creating a roster to provide their own daycare centre for preschool children. Prompted by the many stories she was hearing about isolation and loneliness, Nance suggested that they set up a cooperative time bank. 6 mothers would supervise 24 children on Thursdays. Mothers took a half-day turn on the roster for every 4 days that their child attended the Freedom Club. This enterprise flourished quickly, with the children free from the confines of home and the unrostered mothers free with time of their own. Additionally, the contact between parishes fostered a sense of community, and the group registered formally as a cooperative business entity at the end of 1974. Cooperative ventures in housing and banking were something of a hallmark of the Melbourne YCW, and many parishes had credit unions. So the structure of businesses organised for mutual benefit and profit sharing, not the accumulation of capital, was very familiar. It helpfully formalised the collaborative assumptions of parish life and shared the relational authority that was Nance's hallmark too. At the same time as Nance was developing this program, the parish had engaged young architects Maggie Edmund and Peter Corrigan to build a whole parish complex. Nance was very concerned about the risk of institutionalising a vibrant spirit. She remarked, "We had a very alive Sunday worship, both at the chapel, which was set up in the presbytery, and in the Keysborough Hall, which they borrowed. I had very real fears about what will happen when people enter the church. I think a number of people have discovered that they are the church, and I would not want to see a building minimise or destroy this in any way." Her first concern to preserve the active commitment of ordinary people to God's mission in the parish was clear. Rather than a brick and steel structure, she found a lot going for God's idea to dwell with his people in a tent. Nance saw a dichotomy between people and building more starkly than others might have done, but her distinction underlined the conviction that everyday life was the realm of the sacred. As it turned out, Edmonds and Corrigan captured attention nationally for the way they translated Catholic tradition into the vernacular of an Australian suburb. You can see the Church of the Resurrection there. But while the church plans were being discussed, the first actual building effort was directed to the Freedom Club. Maggie Edmonds provided clever plans that relocated 2 domestic houses onto the site, painted them in bright colours, reoriented them. Unfortunately, there's no photo. That's the parish site with many ambitious structures imagined, and these are the plans for the Freedom Centre. This time, looking at these buildings, there was no suggestion from Nance that they could do just as well in a tent. And perhaps she noticed too that her resistance was to aspects of the institutional church, and she sought a dispensation from her vows. She stayed on, however, in her role in the parish for another 4 years, and then she moved to a similar role interstate. You can see her sitting in the middle of the settee in that period after she's left the congregation. That transition, it was a transition that some congregations and some parishes couldn't have imagined, but it worked at Keysborough. So I'm drawing to a close on this example of a resilient ongoing ministry. The Freedom Club still exists as an outreach of Catholic Social Services Victoria. A resilient ministry founded by a committed woman who, in pre-conciliar terms, failed in her vocation. The paradox and the priority given to communion in how her decision was received is important. In all the possible examples of interesting new initiatives and talented members, the modest Keysborough Freedom Club takes us back most explicitly to the insight Pat Fox offered us at the outset, that contemporary religious life has resources and capacity for the living of communion, for the practice of radical solidarity. The Joseph's dimensions of the presentation history, the commitment to act, give that call to communion a practical edge. The alternative economics of cooperatives and mutual societies, where democracy extends from politics into the workplace, has been growing in importance since the global financial crisis. It's been important at key periods through history of financial crisis, I think it's fair to argue. And alongside the call to synodality, there's also the economy of Francesco, an ongoing movement initiated by Francis, sponsored by the Vatican, to bring together young economists to work in the spirit of Francis of Assisi for an economy of peace and an economy of friendship with the earth. I wonder what the Rewilding of Authority in vowed religious communities has to offer these young academics, activists, and entrepreneurs. The stereotype says co-ops fail because, in the end, people do not get along. In fact, cooperatives and mutuals are more adaptive and resilient and likely to flourish more often than most traditional capitalist businesses. But in both contexts, if a key struggle is how people manage their authority and interactions in workplace decision-making, and if alternative models enable flourishing communities, then how might the inherited wisdom of women religious, formed for so long in just getting on with it and living their theology, mentor the processes for difficult decisions? It's very striking, I think, that the list of values that inform the emerging solidarity or economy resonate with the vowed commitment of religious communities and with their idealism. Luis Rosetto Miliaro, who writes mostly in Spanish, credits the long list of words beginning with C to the surprising resilience of businesses and other community enterprises organised for mutual benefit. They succeed because of the C factor, he says: cooperation, compassion, collaboration, coordination, community, and confianza, trust. They also work at the speed of trust, building the sense of reliable interdependence as they go, which is to say they depend on relational authority. Paradoxically, again, as the language of congregations like the Presentation Sisters becomes less formally religious or less traditionally coded, the discussions in circles of solidarity economy is increasingly open to expressing shared conviction. It seems to me that this is faith being made incarnate in new ways, not necessarily less theological ones, and that bridge building across shared and complementary ideals is potentially a new form of ecumenism. We saw earlier the word cloud of Ahmad's 1968 address to the chapter of renewal. You can see it here again on the right. Compare the 2014 statement of identity from the same congregation. I think it's really interesting. So women, not Christianity, is central. God and world are both still there, and they're relatively larger. Love appears prominently now, and within, a word about relationship also features. I'm not sure how we'd select a statement from the solidarity economy to compare, but I suspect it would be possible to find one in some enterprises that offers a good match to the 2014 Women Religious. The sociologist, lawyer and activist Marina Citrin was interviewed about her work on new forms of social organisation, and she found unexpected ways of discussing that. She says, as you can see, "I was honestly a bit surprised at how much people spoke of love and care as necessary to create the sort of world they desire. But now, in retrospect, the fact that the forms of organising are all about social relationships, paying attention to power, making sure people are heard and can speak, prioritising voices often excluded and ignored, organising events with food, drink, music and other tools that make them more social, were crucial and often necessary for survival. Care is at the heart of the new forms of organising." In an address to a delegation from the economy of Francesco last year, Francis urged what I'm thinking of as a rewilding of economic authority. He told the group of eminent thinkers, "The world of economics is in need of change. You will not change it only by becoming ministers, Nobel Prize winners or great economists, which are all good things. Rather, you will change it above all by loving it in the light of God, by injecting into it the values and strength of goodness with the evangelical spirit of Francis of Assisi. He was the son of a merchant. He knew the merits and defects of that world. Love the economy. Concretely, love the workers, the poor, prioritising the situations of greatest suffering." Francis said, "Today I would like to leave you with 3 words. Be witnesses, do not be afraid, hope without tiring." That sounds to me like a call that religious communities know well. Be witnesses, do not be afraid, hope without tiring. I'm a historian, not a preacher, but perhaps I can borrow the exhortation from Francis and think about it in relation to women's religious communities. In any case, history shows us that we cannot know how vowed communities will respond to any given set of circumstances. We can only know that there is a theological guarantee that there will always be women and men seeking God in this life form, and we can know alongside that that there are reserves of creativity and hope in that spirited life. But the work of communion that has been so much part of the last 60 years of these communities' work together, life together, that work of communion has been so much part of a hallmark that there must be something there to offer another way of thinking. And these are surely days when we need to see the Spirit at her wildest and most urgent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharine, for your inspiring, informative and wonderful talk this evening to open our conference. Katharine has kindly agreed to take questions or engage in conversation with people in the audience for a few minutes. So if you would like to do that, if anybody has anything they would like to say to Katharine or to reflect on, or indeed to ask her, you're very welcome to do that. I was curious, Katharine, when I was listening to you talking about the art of living in communion and the challenge that has been presented in the post-Vatican II period with the move away from living in community. When you worked with the presentations on your new study, to what degree has the move away from community living and convent life challenged what you call the art of living communion?
It's a good question, Deirdre. I think they would say that living in communion is no more straightforward when you're living separately than when you're in the same house, that the challenges are different. I was talking earlier too with someone about, was it you, about how there are Australian congregations who moved out of their convents because after the Second Vatican Council there was a sense that that was what you had to do. It was the literature coming from the States especially that made them think we can't be living in these big houses anymore. The convents in Australia were never as large as some of the institutions overseas. You'd be more likely to have 20 or maybe 20 people. Star of the Sea was very big. It had 56 people. So relatively speaking, they're not the houses of hundreds. And there's a certain amount of regret that they didn't look more carefully at what they were doing then, and maybe find new ways of adapting in the property that they had rather than scattering. But the process of decision making collectively that across the different congregations they've adopted since the council has brought to the surface the need to be able to communicate well, the need to be able to really speak what's in their hearts, that if there was ever a kind of command and control model, and they would say, well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but if there ever was that, there's no possibility that people are living in those circumstances now. And so there's a lot more to negotiate. And the question of how you communicate about that, keeping a clear eye on the situation that you're actually in, on the way the context is changing. There's a certain complexity about decision-making and about keeping the community moving together that's come to the fore. And that includes balancing people who've got clear sense of commitment in one direction that isn't necessarily held by everybody. So how do you keep the community, focused on a shared life? What does that mean? Whether that's easier or not when you're under the same roof, I think is kind of out for judgment.
Sure, it is. Yeah, it is. Anybody have anything that they would like to? Yes, over here. I think we have a microphone.
Right. Thank you, Catherine. I really enjoyed your presentation, and especially the references to Pat Fox and how you wove in. My question is almost going a step further. As many religious congregations are now looking to come to completion or come to fulfilment, I was really intrigued the image of leaven, and as they appoint commissaries and others who may be across multiple congregations. Do you have any thoughts on how that might, in some way, almost stifle that leaven, or how you see that happening into the future as the congregations try and live really until they die in many ways? So, thank you.
Yeah, that's quite a hard question. I think there is something mysterious about it, and I think the sisters would say that too, that they're living into a mystery and they don't know what it's going to be like. And so that's why the theological underpinning that this life form is guaranteed, it's not for nothing, and the paradox of it disappearing disappearing in one form or in one congregation doesn't negate the work that's been done before. All of that we kind of need to lay the groundwork and say. In terms of how the leaven of particular communities continues, part of it is in the memory. So part of it is in the work of archivists and historians and in the telling of stories. So Ahmad Tembi needs to be remembered in Melbourne. And so, does Shirley MacDonald and Raphael Considine and Nance Morgan. And there's a way in which knowing who these people are and the kind of work they did keeps the leaven fermenting. So our work is part of that. The letting go of the reality of the living, breathing people who are committed to this particular charism is a hard reality, but we need to also lay claim to the hope and the mystery of it. That's a kind of exhortatory response, but thank you for the question.
And we have two questions, so yes first, and then Malky second.
First, thank you for that very creative analysis of scripture and mission and service. And I appreciate you defining rewilding. I was feeling like I had missed something in my vocabulary. But my question is, for the presentations, we all were called to go back to the original founding spirit. So at that point, would they have considered the Australian Foundation, the Irish Foundation, and what are the elements that rose to the surface? Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good question too. It's nano all the way down, so it's Irish. As well as their own story, across the country there are various presentation foundations that came from different convents in Ireland, and they remember their local foundation story more strongly. So there's Nano and then there's the local founders, and in Victoria there are two. One from Limerick, one set from Limerick came to Windsor, and another set fled a fairly oppressive regime. That may not be a fair way to put it. Anyway, they came from Wagga Wagga and set up Star of the Sea. And those two centres were relatively separate until diocesan regulations compelled them to amalgamate. And still for a long time, if you entered at one, you worked in the schools that had been founded by that one and not the other. So there are interesting differences in culture. So they go back to Nano and they go back to the story. Well, in various ways, there's been change over time in how she's understood. Deirdre would be able to talk to us about this. But Raphael Considine, who was at the Peace Rally, is quite an important figure internationally in writing an early biography of Nano in 1977 and in commemorating the memory of her in a number of poems. And the Victorian Presentation Sisters, talk about getting this lovely card from somewhere in Ireland, this inspiring verse. Oh my God, it's by Rafe. So what am I saying there? They recover her commitment to the poor. They recover her love of the community. They don't talk much in Benedictine terms explicitly, but to my mind, a lot of the recovery of the charism and the relationality chimes very much with that early understanding of what the rule offered to monasticism in general.
Thank you. And Malky, you have a question.
I think one of the things I was struck by your presentation is the fact that I think in our society today, what we want more than anything is belonging. And people are crying out for it, but they don't know how to obtain it. And I think your description of leaven in community is very true of the Benedictine rule, in the sense that the abbot is the leaven, but he's the leaven as long as he respects all the community members, like you mentioned, to have encouraged to have the weak, the weak versus strong, which is a beautiful line in the Rule of Benedict. And then the other thing I think when I see American Benedictine history is, and this is just the Benedictine charism, is when the community has no longer connected with what it founded, it doesn't exist, it falls apart. Because the essential of a Benedictine community is that they have to do something together as a group. And that's very much part of their identity. And once that is shattered, or once they become not being able to influence what they created and what they responded to and saw a need for, and see other ways it can adapt, I think the community disintegrates.
I think that's really interesting. In terms of the presentation sisters, there's huge anxiety as they are moving out of primary schools, and people are doing all sorts of things, working in secular organisations, studying psychology, moving into social work, chaplaincy, publishing ventures, like there's a myriad of things. And Amard especially, who's at the beginning of all of this, continually wants to redefine all of the new ministries as education. We're doing all of these, and they call them allied works, but they're allied to education. And then as the vocabulary changes, people who are doing new ministries say, actually, we'd rather not be called allied works. Can we just be, in mission? And it does, that question of how do you maintain a corporate sense when you have no shared work? It's a big sociological question. I'm looking at Pat. And yeah, it's sharp. And for some communities, maybe I think the presentation sisters did adapt. Do have a sense of corporate life, although their actual work scattered. But it's certainly different from when they were all in schools, and they still maintain some things about. Things slow down in the school holidays. People haven't worked in schools for 30 years, but, oh no, we can't, we're not meeting then because, that's the break. So there is a kind of mentality or a corporate sense of the rhythm. But I think you're right. There's something about shared work that brings people into a different kind of relationship, which is why the cooperative mutuals model is intriguing to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
To go along with what you're saying, I think it goes back to the whole thing about See, Judge, Act. And the whole idea about there is always a charism that threads through. So when you look at the times, the signs of the times, how are we interpreting that? It goes back to Nano, but Nano isn't here. So what is the charism and the values and the mission that is the thread through everything? So how do you connect that? So I think this whole idea that you were talking about rewilding is, and then Francis's thing at the end about be witnesses, see, have hope, or, don't be afraid. Most of the congregations, isn't that what they did? When they set on that big boat from Ireland, they had no idea what the hell they were getting into. Most of our congregations were like that. But it's how do we reinterpret the signs of the times, given the charism, and be able to see, judge, act? We call that theological reflection. We call that something else, whatever the latest term is, So I think it all goes through the whole thing, but it's that charism is what calls us. Yeah. That's the thread.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yep, I think beautifully said. It's also interesting that presentation sisters would say to each other, well, if Nano were here, this is what she'd be doing. And then others would say, if Nano were here, this is what she'd be doing. But beyond it, there is this outreach to the poor, women and families especially. So it is about reconnecting or seeing anew how the charism lives in new circumstances. Yep.
We have one question here, one question here.
Thank you. I spotted in the two word clouds that in the later one, I didn't notice that the word mother is there in the first, but not in the later one. And as far as I can see, anyway, I might have missed it. But it just made me think about the role of the mother, the leader in the community, and how that might have changed. There's certainly a school of thought that says that the mother, this idea of mother-child has a very infantilization of the community, but the mother also has a role of nurturing and compassion. And as the communities dispersed and lived separately, and also indeed didn't share work in the same way that they did in the past, how did the role of leader, very specifically as mother, was she no longer seen as mother? Was she seen as being a more kind of secular leader, CEO or something like that?
Yeah, no, they've never gone for CEO. But certainly the mother title disappears. And Ahmad, she becomes known as Mary Ahmad. And sister comes into it. But Mother Sebastian was always Mother Sebastian. And in some ways, Ahmad was a more conservative figure than Sebastian. It's an interesting thing. So I think there's a commitment to know and respond individually to the women who are part of the group that persists and strengthens as the heavier forms of institutional authority become more dialogical. Mother Sebastian would have been able to decide where people are going by giving them a note at breakfast. Ahmad is in conversations, and leaders after her are in even more extensive conversations and with wider groups of people. Actually, that's one of the things that changes, that the role of the council becomes much more important, and the way in which chapters are organised, more people participating, the sense of more voices alongside the leader, maybe undercuts a particular kind of maternal nurturing from a single figure, but it brings a different sense of collaboration and shared community, and Butcher's paper and processes of decision making that at first people are drawing cartoons and putting them up on the board because they're having these business meetings, and it's a kind of all-in enterprise where everyone's thinking together, and then it becomes more the way they do things. People are not so stunned by the fact that there is a lot of paper to read and they're working through it together. That becomes more normal. But it's a long way from Mother General in January setting out a plan for the next year, which involves allocating people to schools primarily.
Yeah. We'll just take one more before we exhaust you completely.
I was also fascinated by those leadership qualities you were talking about. But I wasn't quite clear, were you sort of extolling superiors to, of the values? I wasn't quite clear of your purpose of mentioning them, as fascinating as they were. Were you suggesting that the superiors are sort of drifted off and some of those values have been lost?
No, I was referring to Benedict, because if we're talking about rewilding, where's the marker for authority? Where's the point that we want to return to? And I think in some periods between now and the 6th century, the zeitgeist of some communities hasn't been to be loved rather than to be feared. The kind of there's a different dynamic. Where are they? But the midwife analogy that Kim Harris offers about bringing to birth something in the person, that's very clear in Benedict. We're here because we're seeking God, and we're going to, walk together, run together on this path towards salvation. There have certainly been some periods in the history of religious life when it's been, we're here to do the work that the bishop needs us to do. And if that involves destroying people, if people need to become something than something other than who they really are, well, then that's for a greater good. That kind of thinking is a long way from the original authority, and I'm not saying that the Presentation Sisters had drifted that far, but the post-Vatican II move to reclaim the charism, the move that sees women come to the centre of that word cloud and their understanding of themselves as women called to a presentation charism, that's a shift that comes out of reclaiming some of this personal but collective sense of call. I'm not sure that I've answered exactly. So Benedict's not there. Benedict's there as an original marker, and at different times we can see this being followed more or less faithfully.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katharine, and thank you for being so generous. Very grateful to Katharine for being so generous and taking questions and conversation, which is always an exhausting thing to do after giving a keynote address. I was pleased, I suppose you could say, to see that Sister Amard's little card with the Schultz cartoon had survived for whoever gathered her papers and gave them to the archivist, didn't weed out the little cartoony postcards. And here it is being used as a piece of evidence, a constant reminder to us of the importance of keeping everything to let the archivist make the decision, which is really what we're about. And I loved your reference to the inherited wisdom of women religious, which is what we gather for at this conference every 3 years. And I think we're going to hear an awful lot about the inherited wisdom of women religious across the next few days. Thank you again, Katharine, on behalf of all of us, for giving us a very stimulating and important start to an important conference. Thank you.